Welcome to Round Hill Radio, the podcast from Round Hill Community Church. Through our conversations, we discover the holy and the ordinary, find moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we're talking about when we talk about faith.
Welcome to Round Hill Radio. I'm Leslie.
And I'm Ed.
I'm Kris.
Welcome, Kris.
Hey, Kris.
Thank you.
It's great to see you, and welcome back to Round Hill Radio. You've been a guest.
My second time. Thank you.
Before. That's great. So, Kris, you are a retired pastor, and you're ordained in the United Church of Christ. Is that right? Or is it the
in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ?
Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And you are the co-founder of God Before Guns and currently serve as the executive director. So, and actually, how long have you served in that capacity?
Our organization was founded in 2013.
Okay. All right.
Since then.
Great. Well, we're so glad to have you as a guest. And one of the things that I wanted to start off with in terms of our conversation was just give us a sense, Kris, about how God Before Guns got started. What was the impetus for creating the organization?
Okay. We started in earnest after the Sandy Hook shootings.
Okay.
That happened in December 2012. The timing, as none of us will ever forget, was that was during Advent in December, weeks before Christmas. And it was a time in my life as a pastor and a weekly preacher that I couldn't not pay attention to what had happened. And so I preached about that Sunday, and then Christmas Eve rolled around, and it was still so fresh.
Sure.
That again, it came up. And then a group of us just started meeting in our boardroom on Tuesday nights. It wasn't always the same group of people, but people would wander in and out. And we said, we're just going to sit with Sandy Hook, with gun violence, and talk about it. And so we had many Tuesday nights of, some tears. Sometimes when we didn't have a particular direction, there were, some anger expressed. There were personal stories shared. And then that grew into inviting other churches into the conversation. And so there were a group of churches near us that there would be a couple of people who might join us on a Tuesday night from another congregation. Mm-hmm. And then it grew from that into not everyone was Christian who was coming on those Tuesday nights. And so we became a multi-faith coalition of folks. And so we started about as grassroots as you could start. And we started, hosting events, vigils, and panel discussions and things. We started that really before we had a full organization. We sort of hit the ground running and then formed as an organization as we were going. So it's fun to revisit those roots sometimes to show that good things happen when, as Jesus would say, when two or three are gathered.
Right. Yeah.
Of how it started. And Sandy Hook was the impetus for that. But certainly I had been grieving over so many gun violence events since then. And I had become aware when there was a shooting at Chardon High School, which is a suburban high school near the church I was serving. Mm-hmm. Families who were there that day, fortunately, they were not shot, but they were there in the cafeteria when the shooting happened. Mm. Started talking to the youth in our church and found out that they were doing drills, and they'd been on lockdown, and it didn't matter what school they went to, public or private or religious or charter. They all were going through this, and this was in 2012, and mm-hmm. only increased since then. So it really came from the idea that what kind of a world are we building for our children?
Right. One of the things that we had mentioned just briefly before we began the program is the fact that it doesn't really make sense. It's not accurate to talk about instances of recent gun violence, as if suddenly we haven't had an experience of that for a while and suddenly we do. Can you actually share your response about how you look at that?
Absolutely, because as I said, we started in the wake of the Sandy Hook shootings, and that was after building through other mass shootings, that level of involvement for us. But it was very quickly, we became more aware than we already were of the daily toll of gun violence. Mm-hmm. My church was in an inner-ring suburb in Cleveland, and we started looking at the entire county around us and the number of gun deaths every day. Mm-hmm. And that even though it's mass shootings that grab our attention, at least for a news cycle, and it might increase people's awareness where that shooting happened, but the greater toll is every day. The latest official figures are that there are 109 people killed every single day in our country. And that amounts to about 38,000 for the year. Those numbers are likely larger now because that data is a couple of years old and gun deaths are on the rise again. So yes, it's the daily toll. In our neighborhoods and in our homes, and whatever grabs our attention that causes us to move our awareness into advocacy. Mm-hmm. It's good that there's that awareness, but we never do a vigil around a major event without also remembering who has been killed in Cleveland during that same time period.
Right. I'm curious, Kris, so obviously this has been a concern. It sounds like this was a concern for you even well before Sandy Hook, and your passion for justice was around before that time.
Right.
What have you noticed, or have you noticed any change in the way that Americans seem to be viewing gun violence, or the struggles that we seem to have as a country being able to talk about gun ownership in the context of gun safety and so on? Do you feel like there's a shift in public opinion about this, and if so, in what way?
I believe that there is. We see it whenever we are at the State House or in the halls of Congress, or we are any other place where we are together with other gun violence prevention groups, that the numbers on our side are growing. There are a number of organizations now, and we have learned how to work together and how to collaborate and cooperate with each other. We have seen the difference in midterm elections, where candidates who at one point a few election cycles ago would never have mentioned gun violence or gun control or gun reform or anything to do with guns as part of their platform. And in the midterms in 2018, for example, it was a number one issue for many candidates, and it was a winning issue. So certainly we see numbers like that. We also know from polling that vast majorities of Americans favor things like background checks, mm-hmm. Or red flag laws, or child access prevention laws. Mm-hmm. There are many states that have such laws. They are among the public opinion. They are strongly favored. So yes, we have seen growth, even though certainly what is called to our attention is inaction on the national level, mm-hmm. And some of our leaders not not looking at necessarily the will of 90% of Americans who favor background checks, for one example.
Yeah. What do you feel about the language that we use when we talk about guns? It seems like we can't use language in a way that doesn't automatically put us in some kind of conflicted position. Gun control, gun safety, gun violence, all these terms have gotten kind of muddied up when they're placed next to each other. How do you help us with this? How do we get help with this?
Well, if we could figure that out in this podcast, I would appreciate that. Certainly, it would make our job easier. But it also
be a longer podcast.
The rhetoric around any hot button issue right now is so tough. But certainly, gun violence, yes. People want to know that their Second Amendment rights will be respected. Mm-hmm. They want to trust that a red flag law is not going to be a slippery slope into government confiscation of guns, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. They're extreme views. We just try to keep the message a positive one of this is. Background checks are something that gun owners can agree on, that if you own a gun, you should have to go through a background check. If you're a gun owner, well, okay, I went through a background check, then someone else wanting to own a gun should go through the same thing. And to common sense. We say that a lot. Mm-hmm. And it's actually about 1/3 of American households are gun owners. Mm-hmm. 1/3 of Americans households are gun owners, but about 3% of Americans own about 1/3 of the total number of guns in our country. In other words, a very small percentage of Americans own a lot of guns, an average of 40 guns for that over 100 million guns. So quite often the loudest voices are the extremist voices or the powerful voice up until recently of the NRA promoting gun ownership in a way to appeal to that extreme, rather than the vast majority of gun owners who respect the right to own a gun and to have it for hunting or personal protection in their homes, but are not advocates of us arming ourselves against each other, for an example. And we ask at our organization, we are not anti-gun ownership. And certainly there are members of our organization who own guns. Mm-hmm. But we believe that the commandment, thou shalt not kill, ought to be in a higher position than the Second Amendment. We believe that we ought to worship God in the ways that our faith leads us to worship God, rather than worshiping a gun. So that's why we're named as we are, God Before Guns. That says nothing about that you cannot own a gun. It is the law that you can. But we do not believe that comes before our faith in each other and our faith in God that calls us to live peaceably among each other.
Pastor Kris, how much of the conversations you have in your work is about the kind of guns that people own? I feel like as a consumer of news, I see, I would say I see these big events, and I see military style weapons. And I feel like there's a big difference between someone owning that and more hunting or personal protection. And how much of your conversations are about that kind of a thing?
Certainly, there's lots of conversation around that, and we only need to experience another mass shooting in which 20 people can be killed in a matter of a couple of minutes for us certainly to favor that weapons like that should not be readily available and so easy to buy. You don't use a weapon like that for hunting. You don't. A weapon like that is not a particular weapon of choice for you to have in your home to protect against, a home invasion. So, certainly that is part of the conversation. And we live in Ohio, which is an open carry state, which means that you can carry any sort of weapon openly in public. And how do you distinguish between someone who has an assault rifle over his shoulder, that he's a good guy, and someone else has a weapon like that and is going to use it for mass destruction? Yes, there are certainly acceptable uses of guns, and some of that is protected by the Second Amendment. However, there is no amendment to our Constitution that is unlimited and without any sort of consideration or restrictions.
Mm-hmm. Have you found common cause with some groups that advocate for gun ownership? They're particularly concerned about the respect of their Second Amendment rights, who've joined with you and in common cause?
I would say that it's still difficult for extremists, gun extremists, to have reasonable conversation with our organization. But as I said, that is a minority. It's a vocal minority. It has been a well-funded minority. But gun owners, certainly, as I said, there's when we're having a vigil, we don't know who is a gun owner and who isn't, but we certainly would know who would show up in protest of a vigil armed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tough to have a conversation if someone insists on bringing a loaded weapon into the conversation with them.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not most gun owners.
Yeah. I'm calling back on personal experience a little bit. I grew up in Vermont. When I was in high school, and just prior to the opening of deer season every year, it was incredibly important for a significant minority of my high school population, to get the license for hunting, to be trained properly in the use of a weapon. It was a huge, I would still call it a rite of passage, and so I remember that. And I think that group of people, as I've talked with them over the years, I don't know a lot of those individuals, certainly not as much as I did then, but they in some ways feel targeted, like they're being they're being lumped in with some category that they don't feel that they're a part of,
Well, then I would encourage, hunting groups, and I know they're out there, to make public statements of what they believe about their guns and how they use their guns,
mm-hmm.
and where they think that we have taken Second Amendment rights too far, or where what common sense legislation would they support to use their voices in that way. I think when you look at the numbers of 90% of Americans agreeing on background checks, 90% of Americans don't agree on much of anything. That's a lot of Americans, but certainly a lot of that 90% is pretty quiet about it. And we could use those voices in the movement.
Yeah. It's reminding me of an old phrase that someone said, we always like to talk about practice what you preach. It's equally important to preach what you practice, right?
Absolutely.
So other people know where you stand on things.
Yes.
Kris,
and we find that once people are aware of the issue, the extent of the issue, the numbers of people who are killed, and how the numbers are trending up, and how laws actually do make a difference in a state, that they move from that level of awareness to some sort of advocacy or activism. But you have to have that awareness first, and to have encouragement then to use your voice.
Kris, maybe one final question. As groups are getting together in communities of faith, much like your group started in a very humble kind of way, and then it grew from there. If groups like that are looking for two really good books to read that would help them in their discussion, what would you recommend?
Okay, I'm going to push it, and I'm going to name three. One has not been published yet, but I want to give you a hint that it's coming.
Okay.
The first book I would mention is a book called Beating Guns. Okay. Author is Shane Claiborne and Michael Martin. And I don't know if the name Shane Claiborne is familiar to you. Okay. But Shane and Michael did a tour of the United States a couple of years ago. We were their stop in Cleveland, where they melted down guns to turn them into garden tools, beating swords into plowshares. He participated with Shane and melted down an AR-15. And it was, I should have brought it with me so I could hold it up, but it's now a garden tool. But Shane has written a wonderful book, Beating Guns, and it's hope for people who are weary of violence.
Okay.
So it's very, it talks a lot about, it's very scriptural. It's talks a lot about the history of Christianity before the NRA, but it talks about people opening their hearts. Okay. If we're going to solve this issue, it's not just about laws. It's going to be because we have opened our hearts to the issue. The other book is very recent, and I just finished reading it. It's called Children Under Fire. It's written by John Woodrow Cox, who is a Washington Post reporter, who in the book follows the lives of two children especially, and a few other children who have been affected by gun violence, one through a school shooting and one with his father being killed in Washington, D.C. And it's a good combination of really good research, but also really following the lives of these children and talking about how gun violence has affected. Since the Columbine shootings, there have been over 250,000 children who were in school buildings where there were shootings. So, looking at that toll, and I would highly recommend that book. It was just published this year.
Okay.
Then the third book I would recommend is coming out in July. It's written by an Episcopal priest, Reverend Rosalind Hughes. And the name of it is Whom Shall I Fear? Urgent Questions for Christians in an Age of Violence. The reason I bring it up today, even though it's not published yet, is I've read the book, and I think it will be an excellent way for congregations who are starting on a conversation about gun violence. Who are thinking specifically about how am I safe in my church building on a Sunday morning? Are our children safe in Sunday school? But it's a way of looking at the questions that we are asking ourselves now, but looking at the questions through the lens of the gospel, rather than the latest security software or security companies that are bidding for your attention right now. Looking at this through who we are as Christians, what we believe, and how we expect to live as followers of Jesus. So I'll shoot you a note when the book actually comes out, because I think it will be an excellent book for group study. in churches that are starting to explore this question.
Wonderful resources. And, part of what I'm picking up too today, Kris, and it's been so wonderful to have you back again, but you've really framed this over and over again today in our conversation in terms of, this wonderful historic Christian witness on peacemaking. This is not as if it's something that's, suddenly arose in response to. This has been something that it's rooted right in our Judaic Christian tradition. And so you've really elevated that for us.
Thank you. Thank you for hearing that. The two scriptures that I especially look at, the two stories from the New Testament, are Jesus right before his death, where he tells Peter to put down the sword. Mm-hmm. When that would have probably saved Jesus' life at that moment. But he tells Peter, no swords, no weapons. Mm-hmm. Other is Jesus when he takes that child and holds the child in his arms, much to the disciples' chagrin. They don't want him to take time with the child, but he holds that child. Now, that child was not Jesus' son or daughter. That child likely was not a son or daughter of the disciples. Mm-hmm. But he or she was a child. Right. We are called as adults, as followers of Jesus, to hold children close in our arms and to keep them safe and allow them to grow up in a world without fear of each other, whether or not they are our children. So that's a call for all of us in any church.
Right. Wow. Kris, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Wonderful conversation, and blessings to you and God Before Guns as you continue the work that you're doing.
Thank you. However we can be a resource to you, you know where we are.
We do indeed. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Round Hill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Round Hill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillcommunitychurch.org.